Ethan Cross was pinned against the acid bath at the Quantum Fab cleanroom on a day when the cicadas screamed like knives driving into his eardrums. Samuel Sterling personally pressed the words corporate espionage into Ethan's chest with a red-hot branding iron. The sizzling edges of the dye licked at flesh with a hissing sound, and the stench of scorched skin mixed with acid fumes clawed its way into Ethan's nostrils. Ethan did not scream. Through the rising white smoke, he saw Lily Fontaine loop her arm through Sterling's. The plain silver bracelet he had given her on her wrist reflected cold light under the fluorescent lamps. She turned her face away, her chin tilted slightly upward, like a startled white swan. "Scum like you deserves to rot in the acid bath," Sterling said, dropping the branding iron into a steel bucket with a clang. That face of his was clean, not even a bead of sweat on it, as if he had simply processed a piece of scrapped wafer. 3 summers later, Ethan crouched in an e-waste recycling yard in the Fremont Salvage District, prying motherboards out of discarded electronics. Solder grit packed itself under his fingernails. The knees of his cargo pants were worn white, and his sleeves were permanently stained with flux that could never be washed out. He used a $3 screwdriver to pop the RF shield off a dead smartphone, his hands steady as a surgeon's. Mountains of old circuit boards piled around him reeked of charred epoxy. Overhead, a ceiling fan rattled and clanked, churning the wet heat of the California summer into a thick soup. Across the way, the giant LED screen on the San Jose Convention Center suddenly blazed to life. Samuel Sterling's face occupied the entire wall. He was holding a chip the size of a fingernail, standing before gold lettering that read, Horizon Microelectronics Global Launch. World's first 3-nanometer gate all-around architecture chip. Camera flashes exploded below him like crazy, a wild crackling barrage. Victor Farnsworth, chairman of the Semiconductor Industry Association, stroked his goatee and nodded repeatedly, his face creased with smiles tucked into every wrinkle. Ethan tossed a salvaged tantalum capacitor into a steel bucket. It landed with a dull thud. His phone in his pocket buzzed 3 times. A message from Raven popped up, sent through their own encrypted protocol, the signal bouncing through 17 relay nodes. "Boss, I scraped Horizon's S1 filing down to the bone. Your GAA architecture patents are listed as Sterling's work-for-hire inventions, with the filing date backdated exactly 2 full years. The original filing records at the patent office have been physically destroyed, but I fished them back out of the offline backup." Ethan typed 3 words. "Stick to the plan." At the launch event, Sterling was in the middle of explaining the technical hurdles of transitioning from FinFET to GAA architecture. His tone calibrated to perfection, confident but not arrogant, expert but not obscure, with an occasional dusting of dry humor. Waves of knowing laughter rippled through the audience. The PowerPoint on the giant screen advanced to slide 37. A 3-dimensional structural diagram rotated to display the fin profiles, labeled with the words, "World's First." The screen went black. Not a power outage black. It flickered half a second of static first, and then jumped to a piece of 1080p surveillance footage. The timestamp showed it was a late night 3 years earlier. Inside Horizon Microelectronics cleanroom, Samuel Sterling, wearing rubber gloves, plugged a silver USB drive into an air-gapped computer tower. A progress bar popped up in the lower right corner of the screen. Copying. GAA_architecture_full_parametric_simulation_v7. Final. After the progress bar reached 100%, he yanked out the USB drive, opened a stainless steel cabinet beside him, and retrieved a 5-liter jug of industrial-grade hydrofluoric acid, the kind used for wafer etching, and poured it over the tower. The plastic housing instantly erupted in white smoke, curling and deforming like a living thing scalded. The room beneath the stage fell dead silent. Lily Fontaine jerked her head up sharply. She was standing only 3 steps from the edge of the stage, a champagne flute still in her hand. Her gaze cut across the center aisle, over the 100-odd stunned faces, and landed on the person standing in the doorway, Ethan Cross, wearing work clothes covered in grease stains, a woven plastic sack full of scrap circuit boards slung in his left hand. A broken probe card poked out of the sack's opening, its needle tips still coated in alumina powder. His hair was shorter than 3 years ago, his cheekbones sharper, but his eyes were still those same eyes, black and deep, the bottom nowhere in sight. Security guards closed in from both sides, hands pressed to the radios on their belts. When they were still 5 steps away from Ethan, the crowd suddenly parted, as if sliced open by an invisible knife. Klaus Heidelberg, the rotating chairman of the Global Semiconductor Alliance, strode quickly forward. His graying hair was combed immaculately, the Alliance crest pinned to his dark blue suit. He shouted in English thick with a German accent, "Chief Architect Cross, what are you doing here?" The entire venue went dead silent. A champagne flute slipped from someone's hand and smashed onto the marble floor, shattering cleanly. The chip in Sterling's hand dropped, bounced twice, and rolled to Ethan's foot. Ethan bent down and picked it up. The fingernail-sized die flipped between his fingers. He rubbed his fingertip across the etched patterns on its surface, like touching something far too familiar. He looked up at Sterling. His voice was not loud, but every word came out with absolute clarity. Fin width deviation is 0.3 nanometers. You didn't even run the full TCAD simulation, did you? The channel doping concentration curve was brute force from FinFET parameters. The quantum confinement effect for the GAA structure was never corrected. Klaus took the chip and pulled a portable electron microscope from the inner pocket of his suit jacket. The old man famously never went anywhere without the device. The industry knew he had spent 20 years at Intel's fabs and had handled more wafers than most people had eaten meals. The microscope connected to the main screen via Bluetooth, and the image, magnified 1,000 times, spread across the entire wall. The edges of the circuit traces were covered in fine, dense serrations, as if chewed by a dog. The roughness of the trench sidewalls was visible to the naked eye. Several vias were clearly misaligned. One metal line was already perilously close to an open circuit. "This is the prototype Mr. Cross presented at Stanford 3 years ago," Klaus said, his voice amplified by the microphone, bouncing around the venue. "I sat in the first row of that lecture. He said this was the optimal path for the post-Moore era. I didn't believe him then. I believe him now." He set the microscope down on the table with a bang. "Horizon's so-called production chip can't even reach half the capability of this prototype. How dare you call this a production release?" The laser pointer in Sterling's hand fell, tipped down, and punctured the giant poster behind him. The shaft of the pointer wobbled twice, stabbing right into the words, "Independent Innovation," and tearing a gash through the right half of the word "Innovation." Lily Fontaine charged forward on her 12-centimeter red-soled heels. Her makeup was smeared by tears, her eyeliner bleeding into 2 black smudges, lipstick smeared to her chin. She reached out to grab Ethan's sleeve. Ethan sidestepped a single step. Her hand closed on nothing but air. "Ethan, I was forced," she cried, her voice sharp as glass dragged across glass. "Sterling said if I didn't help him, he would short my father's packaging plant into the ground." Ethan pulled a sheaf of documents from his woven sack, thicker than 2 fingers pressed together, and flung it into her face. The pages scattered with a loud rustle, drifting down like a sky full of white butterflies, blanketing the marble floor. The top sheet was the financial fraud evidence for Horizon Microelectronics over the past 3 years. Every falsified wafer sale revenue entry was circled in red. The very last page bore the signature of the auditing firm partner, who had already been taken away 3 days earlier. "Last week you were still at Pebble Beach Golf Links telling Bernard Quincy that once Horizon went public, you would buy the tenement I lived in back in East San Jose and convert it into a dog kennel." Ethan looked down at Lily, his eyes as if he were looking at a scrapped chip. "You said that while halfway through a bottle of Romani Conti. You shot 72 that day. You were in a very good mood." Lily's face instantly went white. Her lips quivered. She wanted to say something, but her teeth only knocked together, making a chattering sound. SEC enforcement vehicles pulled up silently at the venue entrance. No sirens, no flashing lights. 3 black SUVs glided in noiselessly, like 3 silent slabs of iron. The doors opened simultaneously. More than a dozen people stepped out, all in dark gray business attire, badges from the Bureau of Industry and Security hanging on their chests. The agent leading them was a woman, early 30s, short hair, no makeup, her gaze sharp as the laser source of a lithography machine. Her name was Olivia Vance. She swept a glance over the papers littering the floor, pulled a folded document from her pocket, and held it up to Lily. "Miss Fontaine, You are required to come with us to assist in an investigation into Horizon Microelectronics IPO financial fraud and suspected disclosure violations. You have the right to remain silent, but anything you say can and will be used as evidence." Lily screamed and scrambled backward. Her stiletto heel stamped onto the top of Sterling's foot, the thin heel stabbing straight through the leather upper of his shoe. Sterling doubled over in pain, just in time to see the federal agents behind Olivia holding another piece of paper. An arrest warrant for Bernard Quincy, issued by the Public Integrity Section of the Department of Justice. The charge: conspiracy to collude with foreign entities to endanger national industrial security. Victor Farnsworth used the chaos to edge his way toward the backstage hallway. He moved neither fast nor slow. The expression on his face was perfectly controlled. An esteemed industry titan momentarily startled by an unexpected disruption, choosing to step away temporarily to soothe the mood. Perfectly reasonable. When he pushed open the fire door to the hallway, the handle was ice cold. Someone was standing behind the door. Old Mac, the process engineer who had worked at Horizon Microelectronics for 20 years. His hair was already completely white, even his eyebrows, as if covered by a layer of snow. He was holding a sealed glass jar in both hands. The label on the jar was yellowed, the characters written in marker, the ink bleeding at the edges but still legible. 3 Specimen Batch 001, date, June 17, 3 years ago. The jar was half full of wafer fragments, glowing a faint cold blue under the emergency lights. Chairman Farnsworth. Old Mac's voice was hoarse, like sandpaper scraped over metal. "Do you still remember these samples you ordered me to destroy 3 years ago?" Farnsworth's steps faltered. The corner of his mouth twitched once, so brief it almost didn't exist, but Old Mac saw it. "You said these were all defective scrap, that keeping them would be an embarrassment, and told me to dissolve them in hydrofluoric acid that very night." Old Mac raised the glass jar up to Farnsworth's face. The fragments shifted under the light. "I secretly kept half of them. I recorded the serial number for every single piece, recorded the corresponding experiment parameters, recorded the production logs at the time." He pulled a testing report from his coverall pocket. The cover bore the red emblem of the Stanford Nanofabrication Facility. The results came back yesterday from the lab. The phosphorus doping concentration curve, the fin etch angle, the gate oxide thickness, 3 sets of data match exactly with the paper Ethan Cross published in Nature Electronics back then. The deviation falls within instrument error margins. Farnsworth stretched out his hand to take the report. His hand hung in midair for 3 seconds. He did not take it. His fingers began to tremble, like dry branches in an autumn wind. He opened his mouth. His dentures fell out and hit the floor with a sharp click, piercingly loud in the silent hallway. The financial news exploded that same day. Horizon Micro IPO blocked, hung in the #1 trending spot, followed by a purple-red breaking tag. The servers crashed 4 times. The second headline was "Sterling Plagiarism Confirmed." The third was "Farnsworth Suspected of Evidence Destruction." The fourth was, "Who is Ethan Cross?" By evening, 8 of the top 10 trending topics were connected to this affair. The remaining 2 were a weather forecast and some celebrity's divorce announcement. No one was reading those. Ethan returned to that rented room in the Fremont Salvage District at 9 o'clock at night. The streetlights were a dim yellow. Between the cramped buildings of the old neighborhood, dense tangles of power lines stretched like a giant spiderweb. Grant Cross was crouched by his door smoking, a briefcase at his feet, the zipper half open, a thick stack of documents poking out. Quincy lined up 3 white knights to vacuum up the loose shares before the emergency shareholder meeting, Grant said, stubbing out his cigarette on the sole of his shoe. He stood up and brushed the ash from his pants. "I intercepted all 3 of them. Used those 3 offshore companies you registered in the Caymans, routed through 6 layers of nested funds wrapped 3 rounds deep. They couldn't trace the beneficial owner." He pulled an equity purchase agreement from the briefcase, flipped to the last page, and pointed at the signature block in the lower right corner. "Right now, the Abyss Fund holds 27% of Horizon's outstanding shares. Largest single shareholder. We've locked in voting agreements from 5 of the top 10 shareholders. Combined with our own, that's over 51%. The line is crossed." Ethan took the pen, an old Parker fountain pen, the lacquer on its barrel mostly worn away to expose the brass underneath. He wrote the two words Ethan Cross on the signature line. The strokes were spare and sharp, the downstrokes like blades. "Convene the emergency shareholder meeting tomorrow," he said, handing the pen back to Grant. "Remove the entire board of directors. Change the company name." "Change it to what?" "Abyss." At 8:30 the next morning, the 26th-floor boardroom of Horizon Microelectronics headquarters. The long mahogany conference table could seat 40 people. Today it seated 47. Someone had added extra folding chairs in the corners. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, making the water bottles on the table gleam brightly. The air conditioning was cranked extremely low, but people still kept wiping sweat away. Bernard Quincy sat in a corner, a federal agent on either side of him. The sleeve of his dark blue suit was stained with a bourbon spill from the night before. His tie was crooked to one side. The expression on his face was like that of a man who had just woken from a nightmare and hadn't yet come to his senses. Samuel Sterling sat across from him, his eyes red and swollen, his fingers drumming on the edge of the table in a completely erratic rhythm. At 8:59 the boardroom door pushed open. Ethan Cross walked in. He was wearing a clean white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing a pale pink scar on his wrist, the mark left from an acid splash, the scar tissue left behind after the scab fell off, a mark that would never fade in this lifetime. He walked to the head seat and sat down, placing both hands flat on the tabletop, his gaze sweeping across everyone present. Not a single person made eye contact with him, except for Olivia Vance, who was seated in the first row of the observer seats, a black notebook in her hand. She gave him a small, nearly imperceptible nod. "Effective today, Horizon Microelectronics is renamed Abyss Technologies," Ethan said. His voice was not loud, yet each word drove into the table like a nail. All patents held under the Horizon name, including the 3-nanometer GAA architecture-related patents filed under Samuel Sterling's name, now belong entirely to Abyss Technologies. All commercial activity based on plagiarized work ceases from this day forward. The legal department will immediately initiate litigation proceedings, suing Samuel Sterling and Lily Fontaine for patent infringement, with damages calculated at 1.5 times Horizon's net profits over the last 3 fiscal years. The general counsel stood up, his mouth opening and then closing again. He glanced at Sterling, then at Ethan, swallowed a mouthful of saliva, and sat back down. Sterling suddenly collapsed onto the table and wept. It was not the kind of stifled sobbing. It was a howling wail, snot and tears smeared all over his face, soaking through several pages of the meeting minutes in front of him. He pounded the tabletop with his fist, producing booming thuds. "Ethan, just let me go. I'll give everything back to you, the company to you, the patents to you, the money to you, just let me walk away." Ethan looked at him. His eyes were so cold they held no trace of warmth. 3 years ago, you wiped my experimental data clean down to the last bit. You locked me inside the acid wash room. Standing on the other side of that 20-centimeter thick fire door, you told me, "You will never turn your life around for as long as you live." Ethan paused, lowering his voice even further, so low that only the few people sitting nearest could hear. "You smiled then. Through the glass window you smiled at me." Sterling's crying cut off instantly, as if someone had seized him by the throat. "Record what he just said. Use it as trial evidence," Ethan said, turning his head toward Grant. "Additionally, freeze all assets under his name. The 2 properties in Atherton, the vacation home in Lake Tahoe, the 3 cars, 6 bank accounts, 3 credit cards. Apply them toward the damages. If they are not enough, continue to garnish his future income." Grant nodded, recording rapidly in his notebook. Olivia intercepted Ethan after the meeting concluded. She handed him a formal document. The cover was stamped with the Great Seal of the Department of Commerce, the red classified stamp pressed into the lower right corner, alongside a handwritten control number. "We traced a long-term illicit financial pipeline between Bernard Quincy and Oakmont Semiconductor, involving multiple core pieces of research data from domestic semiconductor initiatives. Oakmont received a targeted subsidy from the Pentagon last year, designated for developing technology solutions designed to constrain the semiconductor capabilities of the United States' strategic competitors. The data Quincy provided was one of their input parameters." She slid a photograph out of the document. It was a transfer record, a Credit Suisse account statement, the number in the amount column followed by 7 zeros. The evidentiary chain is closed. This constitutes endangerment of national security. The threshold for arrest is met. Ethan took the document, his fingertip grazing across the word, classified. He pulled a 3-nanometer wafer from the pocket of his cargo pants and held it up to the sunlight. The surface of the wafer glowed with a pale blue luster, the circuit traces as dense and orderly as a miniature city, shifting into rainbow diffraction patterns under the light. This was produced on our refurbished used tool set, an ASML used DUV lithography system, manufactured in 2004, mothballed in a warehouse for 8 years after being decommissioned by Intel. He handed the wafer to Olivia. Multiple patterning with self-aligned quadruple patterning technology, 7-layer overlay, overlay accuracy 1.5 nanometers. Yield is 92%. That's 7 percentage points higher than Oakmont's production chips, made on their brand new UV scanners. And the cost is only 1/3 of theirs. Olivia took the wafer and turned it over and over in her hands for a long time. You know what this means, right? I know. Ethan slid both hands into his pockets and looked out the window. The San Francisco skyline shimmered a grayish-white in the afternoon sun. The distant Salesforce tower looked like a silver needle piercing into the clouds. Back then they tried to choke us on lithography machines, choke us on EDA, choke us on photoresist. Now they can't choke us anymore. Over the next half-month, the entire semiconductor industry boiled like an anthill doused with a bucket of scalding water. Abyss Technologies announced it would open-source portions of the core code of its 3-nanometer GAA architecture. All domestic companies could use it royalty-free, with only one condition. Any improved technology must be contributed back to the open-source consortium. Intel Foundry, Global Foundries, Micron, one after another, they announced strategic partnerships with Abyss. On the day the news broke, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index hit its circuit breaker going upward. The SOX index surged 8%, and brokerage trading systems crashed for half an hour. Oakmont Semiconductor, joined by Intel and AMD, filed suit against Abyss Technologies in the Northern District of California, alleging infringement of their GAA-related patents. On the very same afternoon the complaint was filed, Abyss's legal department held a press conference and displayed the patent certificates that Ethan Cross had filed 3 years earlier, under the name of the Abyss Fund, in 52 countries and regions worldwide. The priority date was a full 2 years and 3 months earlier than the filing date Sterling had registered at the USPTO. The original copies of these certificates were stacked on the table at the press conference venue, piled half a meter high, each one bearing the official seals and filing numbers of patent offices around the world. The General Counsel looked into the globally live-streaming cameras and said one line in English, "Prove your priority date precedes ours. If you cannot, withdraw your complaint. If you persist in this lawsuit, we will counterclaim for malicious prosecution and seek punitive damages." Oakmont's legal team withdrew the complaint 48 hours later. The CEO wrote 3 words in an internal email, later exposed by hackers. Don't poke him. Victor Farnsworth's 80th birthday gala was on September 18th. He invited every industry notable he could possibly invite, booking out the penthouse ballroom at the Fairmont San Francisco. The crystal chandeliers hung down 9 meters from the ceiling. Fresh flowers were air freighted in from Holland and arranged across entire walls. He wore a bespoke navy silk suit, the association's gold medal pinned to his chest. During his toast, he claimed that he had nurtured young talents like Samuel Sterling and made significant contributions to the American semiconductor enterprise. The ballroom doors were pushed open from the outside. The evening wind poured in, making every candle flame on the tables shiver in unison. Ethan Cross walked in. Old Mac followed behind him, holding that glass jar in both hands. The wafer fragments inside glinted cold under the chandelier light. Every guest in the room turned their heads in unison. Someone dropped a knife and fork onto a china plate with a sharp clang. Exceptionally crisp. Old Mac walked up to the main table and appended the jar of fragments over the 8-tier birthday cake. The crystalline shards mixed into the white buttercream, emitting a faint whiff of acid. Sweetness and acridity churned together. A smell that made people want to vomit. "Chairman Farnsworth, you called these pieces of scrap. Old Mac's voice was not loud, but the 100+ people in the room heard every word with absolute clarity, even the waitstaff in the corner stopping their movements. The Stanford Lab's testing report says this is the first physically realized 3-nanometer GAA architecture wafer fabricated in the United States. It's worth more than all the papers you've published in your entire life. Farnsworth stood up, his chair legs screeching across the marble floor with a harsh noise. He opened his mouth to speak. His lips were purple. His fingers clawed desperately into the tablecloth. The tablecloth yanked downward under his grip, dragging the entire table's worth of wine glasses, bowls, and plates crashing to the floor in a shattering wave. He suddenly foamed at the mouth. His body went rigid and toppled straight backward. The back of his skull plowed into the cake tower. The 8-tier cake collapsed thunderously, buttercream splashing all over his head and face, as if covering him in a thick layer of snow. The gold medal rolled onto the floor and was trampled by a guest fleeing in panic. The medal and its ribbons separated. No one stepped forward to help him up. That night, someone posted a video online, filmed from a corner at the back of the ballroom, the footage shaking violently, but the sound was very clear. The video carried a single caption: 80-year-old fraud dies in cake. The video was shared 200,000 times. The comment section was filled with 2 words, uniform and repeated: pure karma. Farnsworth did not die, as it turned out. The ambulance hauled him away. He lay in the ICU for 3 months. When he came out, his mouth was crooked and his eyes were slanted. His speech garbled and indistinct. He could only mumble repeatedly, "I am a titan." His students, one by one, drew lines severing their ties with him. Even the last doctoral candidate he had supervised deleted Farnsworth's name from the acknowledgments of his dissertation. Lily Fontaine was formally arrested and indicted half a month later. During her detention, she developed severe depression. Every day she clutched that plain silver bracelet and wept. The bracelet was rubbed by her until it shone like a small mirror. When the guard brought her meals, she would dump the food on the floor, saying, "I don't deserve to eat anything this good." Once, when she went into the yard for recreation, she overheard women in the adjacent unit discussing news about Abyss Technologies, saying Ethan Cross had won some award again. She suddenly burst into loud laughter, and then, laughing and laughing, she broke down crying. She clawed at her own hair with her hands, raking 3 bloody lines into her scalp. The prison doctor injected her with a sedative. She slept for an entire day. When she woke up, her first words were, "Is the silver bracelet still there?" Samuel Sterling was sentenced to 12 years. On the day of the first trial verdict, the reporters outside the courthouse were packed 3 layers deep, their cameras and long lenses trained on him in a frenzy as he was pushed into the transport van. He wrote a dozen appeal letters from inside, claiming he had been coerced by Bernard Quincy, claiming everything had been orchestrated by Victor Farnsworth, claiming Lily Fontaine was the real instigator. But all the evidence pointed squarely at himself. The person who had deleted the experimental data was him. The person who had forged the experimental records was him. The person who had taken the patents as his own was him. Lily Fontaine testified against him in court, spilling every detail she knew, including how Sterling had used his father's factory to threaten her, how he had forced her to sign a colleague's termination papers, how he had pinched bruises into her wrist to make her remember who her master was. In the prison library, he found a back issue of Nature Electronics. It contained that original paper. He tore that page out and shredded it into tiny pieces. The surveillance cameras caught the entire act. He was thrown into solitary confinement for 14 days. When he came out, he was a changed man entirely. Whenever he saw anyone in a lab coat, he would bow and mutter, "I am a thief." Bernard Quincy was sentenced to life without parole. All assets were confiscated. No possibility of early release. Most of his overseas assets were clawed back. A small remaining portion, hidden under a shell company in the Cayman Islands, was pursued by Grant Cross with a 30-lawyer team for 3 years. In the end, every last dollar with interest was recovered, plus an additional $20 million in punitive interest. In prison, he developed a myotrophic lateral sclerosis (ALS), the progressive neurodegenerative disease. Within 1 year, he went from walking to a wheelchair, from the wheelchair to a bed, from the bed to a ventilator, until finally even his eyelids could no longer blink. His son issued a public statement overseas disowning him as a father and never returned to visit him once. His wife divorced him. After signing the divorce agreement, she threw the pen onto the table and said, "The biggest regret of my entire life is marrying you." At the end, when Bernard Quincy was dying, the only sound in the hospital room was the beeping of the ventilator. Outside the window, rain was falling. The rainwater streaked down the glass like someone weeping. The short-selling retaliation from Wall Street came crashing in with ferocious momentum. 3 semiconductor giants, allied with a hedge fund, heavily borrowed Abyss Technologies stock on the Nasdaq, and then launched a frenzied hammering, trying to beat the share price down to nothing. They also lobbied the Department of Commerce to place Abyss on the entity list, banning all American companies from selling EDA software, photoresist, and any equipment containing U.S. technology to Abyss. What they did not know was that Ethan had acquired a German EDA company 3 years earlier. That company was called Black Forest Electronic Design Automation, fairly well known in industry circles. Its founder was a wild-haired professor from the Technical University of Munich, obsessed his entire life with developing electronic design tools that no country could ever embargo. When Ethan acquired his company, the professor's single condition was, never sell it to the Americans. Ethan agreed. In 3 years' time, the Black Forest team and domestic engineers co-developed a fully independent EDA system called Flint, a complete closed-loop flow from schematic design to physical implementation to simulation verification, containing absolutely no American technology. At the same time, Ethan signed a 5-year exclusive photoresist supply agreement with Japan's JSR Corporation. The contract amount was kept strictly confidential, but insiders later said the number was so large it kept JSR's president awake for 3 straight nights. On the day the short attack launched, Abyss Technologies stock opened down 15%. Wall Street's strategy was simple. Sledgehammer the price to trigger panic, get retail and institutional investors to follow suit and dump shares, slice the stock price in half, then buy back at the bottom to cover their positions, pocketing the difference and walking away. The operation was run by Richard Connolly, a veteran Wall Street hedge fund manager. In his 30-year career, he had handled over 100 short-selling campaigns without a single failure. Ethan sat in his office staring at the screen. Grant sat next to him, a laptop on his knees, real-time trade data jumping across the screen. Raven was in another room, 8 screens in front of him running different quantitative models simultaneously, his fingers moving across the keyboard as fast as a pianist playing the piano. "How far down have they smashed it?" Ethan asked. 2270, Grant said. "They still have about 60 million shares left to dump." "Eat them." A single word. Grant hit enter. The Abyss Fund had prepared $20 billion, divided across 32 accounts, entering the market simultaneously through different execution channels, eating up every sell order in the market at market price. Every block Connolly smashed down, Abyss swallowed it whole. However much the stock price fell, Abyss bought it back at that price. 15 minutes later, Connolly sensed something was wrong. The chips he was smashing into the market were like stones thrown into a black hole. Not even a sound came back. And the stock price had actually begun to creep slowly upward. He intensified the force of his sledgehammer. Within 1 hour, he consecutively dumped 5 massive blocks, each exceeding 10 million shares. They were all eaten up. Not a single share left. At 2:40 in the afternoon, the short-selling ammunition was completely exhausted. Abyss Technologies' stock price began a violent surge upward, ripping from the opening price of $22.70 all the way up to $32, an 18% gain. Connolly's entire short position was squeezed. His paper losses began ticking upward at a rate of millions of dollars per second. He sat in his Manhattan office in New York watching the numbers on the screen jump to red, jumping redder and redder, until they were red to the point of black. When the closing bell rang, the red landline phone on Richard Connolly's desk rang. He picked it up, listened for 3 seconds and placed the receiver back down. Then he opened the bottommost drawer of his desk, pulled out a Colt revolver, shoved the barrel into his mouth and pulled the trigger. Afterward, the cleaning crew found a sticky note on his desk. On it, written in a trembling scrawl, was a single line. "I underestimated this man's depth of layout. He spent 3 years setting 32 moves, and I didn't see a single one." That night, The front-page headlines of every global financial media outlet were about this incident. Bloomberg's headline read, "Hedge fund titan dead after $22 billion short squeeze on U.S. chip stock." Reuters used, "The American chip revenge." The Wall Street Journal ran a 4,000-word deep dive analyzing Ethan Kross's rise, and its conclusion was, "This man's every step landed ahead of every industry inflection point, as if he were someone who could see the future." Olivia Vance's true identity was fully revealed 3 months later. It was late at night. Inside the cleanroom laboratory at Abyss Technologies, only the two of them were present. The newest 5-nanometer architecture prototype had just come off the pilot line and was placed under the electron microscope. The image projected onto the large screen on the wall. The circuit traces looked like a meticulously planned city streets, overpasses, river channels, all orderly and well arranged. The width of each line was only 5 nanometers, equivalent to 50 silicon atoms lined up in a row. The background light was adjusted to a deep blue. The traces glowed with a silvery white radiance against the blue background, as beautiful as an abstract painting. Olivia pulled a credential from her pocket and placed it on the lab bench. Special Agent, Bureau of Industry and Security, Department of Commerce. Badge number 009. 3 years ago, I began working the Quincy case. I traced all of his financial flows, tracked 17 of his offshore accounts, but for the longest time I couldn't find the ironclad evidence linking him to foreign collusion. She looked up at Ethan. The blue light of the laboratory reflected in her eyes, like 2 small patches of deep ocean. "In the end, it was you who dragged him down from his horse." Ethan did not respond. He walked to the corner of the laboratory, opened an old rusty metal locker, and pulled out a tin box. The surface of the tin box was covered in rust spots. Its edges were dented in several places, as if it had been carried along on a very long journey. He opened the tin box. Inside were 2 black and white photographs, a young couple. The man wore a suit, and the woman had short, neat hair. Their smiles were as clean as a cloudless sky. Next to the photographs lay a piece of heirloom jade, a crack splitting down its middle, a dried dark red stain still clinging to the crack, carefully mended with clear tape. 2 characters were carved into the jade cross. "These are my parents," Ethan said. His voice was very soft. 20 years ago they died in a car crash on the freeway. The brake lines had been cut. At that time they were working on a project called Project Aegis, trying to develop an indigenous general-purpose processor architecture. The project had only been initiated for 3 months. My father's research notes were stolen from his hotel room. The very next day, a company overseas released a processor with an architecture that was exactly identical. He picked up the jade pendant and rubbed the pad of his thumb across that crack. I pried this out of my father's hand in the hospital morgue. He was clutching it so tightly that no matter how anyone tried, they couldn't pry his fingers open. Later, the coroner used something to relax the muscles before they could remove it. He flipped the jade pendant over. On the back, a small line of characters was carved, the strokes crooked and uneven, as if scratched in with something sharp. "Ethan, hold on." The laboratory fell silent for a very long time. The air purification system emitted a soft white noise, like the distant sound of ocean tide. Olivia walked over and stood beside him. She did not touch him. She did not speak either. She just stood there. The blue light stretched both of their shadows very long, casting them across the white anti-static floor. "I'm not fighting alone either," Ethan suddenly said. Olivia turned her head to look at him. "My parents' case was ruled an ordinary traffic accident back then. The scene was scrubbed clean. The hard drive from the highway surveillance system was physically destroyed the very next day after the incident. I investigated for 20 years." He placed the jade pendant back into the tin box and closed the lid, his movements very gentle. "Last year, Raven recovered that hard drive for me. From the fragmented data, he pieced together the license plate of the vehicle that caused the crash. The plate was stolen, but the vehicle identification number was real. We traced the VIN through used car transaction records. The ultimate owner of the vehicle was a man named Percival Quincy." "Percival Quincy?" Olivia's eyes sharpened instantly. "Bernard Quincy's father-in-law?" "Correct." Ethan locked the tin box and placed it back inside the locker. 20 years ago, Percival Quincy was the chairman of Aegis Semiconductor's sole competitor. My father's project directly threatened his business interests. He hired someone to engineer that crash. After the fact, he gave the perpetrator a sum of money and arranged for him to go to Canada. That man died of liver cancer in Vancouver last year. On his deathbed, his conscience found him. He wrote down the entire process in a letter and mailed it back. Where is the letter? In a safe. The original. With a signature, a thumbprint, and notarization. Ethan closed the locker door. Percival Quincy passed away 5 years ago. Bernard Quincy was the man he single-handedly groomed and elevated. This thread, I've been pulling on it for 20 years. I finally pulled it to the end. Olivia was silent for a moment. Then she pulled a document from her briefcase and placed it on the lab bench. These are Percival Quincy's travel records and communication records from his final years. Physical evidence we obtained from another case. In the last 3 years before he died, he traveled overseas 3 times every year. Every time he met with the exact same group of people: Oakmont executives, certain foreign officials, members of defense advisory panels. Ethan picked up the document and flipped through it. The corner of his mouth tugged faintly. It couldn't be called a smile, but the chill in the depths of his eyes receded a little. So when you were targeting Bernard Quincy, you were actually pulling the thread leading to his father-in-law. Yes. Olivia took the document back. I've been pulling on this thread for 5 years. When I investigated all the way to the end, I found that you already had the thread clutched in your hand. 2 hands gripping the same thread. The Cross family recognition ceremony had been arranged by Olivia. Back then, the Cross family estate manager Lucius Cross had seized the family fortune after Ethan's parents passed away. He transferred the core assets of Cross Enterprises into his own name. To the outside world, he publicly declared that Ethan had already died in the car crash as well. He produced a forged death certificate, with a genuine official seal stamped on it. He had bribed someone in the county records office. The old Cross family mansion was occupied by him. The Cross family factories were sold off by him. The Cross family ancestral graves were relocated by him to a barren hillside without even a headstone erected. But he did not know that Ethan was still alive. Ethan had been secretly taken away by his grandmother's closest friend and hidden in an old Oakland neighborhood for 20 years. That elderly woman passed away the year before last. On her deathbed, she pulled Ethan's hand over and pressed a savings passbook into his palm. Inside it was saved $230,000. Money she had accumulated over a lifetime of collecting scrap and recyclables. She said, "Your parents were good people. You must make them proud." The day of the recognition ceremony was December 23rd, the eve of Christmas Eve. The old Cross mansion had been renovated by Lucius into a place of gaudy splendor. 2 rows of holiday lights were strung across the courtyard. The living room had been fitted with a massive crystal chandelier. Even the door frames were wrapped in gold leaf trim. Lucius sat in the patriarch's chair, wearing a silk smoking jacket, rotating 2 walnut shell worry balls in his palm, his face glowing with ruddy satisfaction. He had just closed a deal, selling the last remaining piece of Cross land to a developer for $300 million. The door opened. It was not knocked open. It was pushed open. Ethan Cross walked in. He wore a charcoal overcoat, with a white dress shirt underneath, the top collar button unfastened. Behind him followed Olivia, Grant, Raven, and 4 federal marshals. Trailing at the very back was the old Cross family groundskeeper, Shepard, now 81 years old. After being thrown out by Lucius, he had been living in a retirement home all this time. He hobbled in leaning on a cane, trembling unsteadily, clutching a mahogany box in both hands. Shepard knelt before Ethan, an 81-year-old man, his knees striking the tile floor with a muffled heavy thud. He opened the box. Inside lay a silver heirloom cup, oxidized black with age. The surface of the cup was engraved with the name Ethan, the strokes of the letters upright and precise. Beneath the cup was pressed a DNA test report, issued by an AABB-accredited lab. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. "This is what I personally placed into the young master's hand on the day he was born," Shepard said, lifting his head. Old tears streamed down, tracing through the deep wrinkles on his face and dripping onto the tile floor. The old master in heaven above. He can see this day. Lucius stood up. His chair shoved backward with a loud clatter. The ruddy glow on his face drained completely away. His lips turning blue. Absolute nonsense. He's an imposter. Ethan Cross died in that crash long ago. I saw the death certificate with my own eyes. He pointed at Ethan, his finger trembling. Where did you dig up this fraud? Coming here to carve up the Cross family estate. Raven slammed a sheaf of printouts onto the table. The pages fanned out with a loud rustle. They were the email records from Lucius's private cloud account. The encryption algorithm had been cracked by Raven over the course of 2 sleepless nights. The subject line, body, attachment, sent time, and originating IP address of every single email had been completely restored with absolute clarity. The very top email had a send date of December 3, 20 years ago, 4 days before the crash. The sender was Lucius Cross. The recipient was Percival Quincy. The body of the email contained only a single line. Break lines have been handled. Payment upon completion. Eliminate the root. I won't be responsible for loose ends. Lucius's face went from blue to gray, like the belly of a dead fish. His mouth opened and closed and opened, unable to utter a single word. His grip went limp. The 2 walnut worry balls dropped to the floor, rolling and clattering into the corner, bouncing off the baseboard and spinning twice before coming to a stop. The marshals stepped forward and clasped handcuffs onto his wrists. The metallic click-click echoed through the empty, cavernous living room. As they hauled him toward the door, he suddenly began thrashing and struggling. In a hoarse, ragged voice he screamed, I am the head of the Cross family. You cannot arrest me. Do you know how much in taxes I've paid to this county? No one paid him any attention. His own son stood at the far end of the hallway, watching this scene from a distance. The expression on his face was as cold as if he were looking at a stranger. Then he turned and walked away. The sound of his leather shoes striking the marble floor grew more and more distant, finally vanishing around the corner of the hallway. On the day Ethan formally assumed leadership of the Cross family, the very first thing he did was restore the family memorial hall. He tore out all the gold ornamentation that Lucius had installed. He brought back the ancestral graves that had been displaced, one after another, and hired the finest stonemasons to recarve the headstones. In the center of the memorial hall, he placed his parents' memorial tablets, made of dark walnut. Carved upon them in his own handwriting were the words, "In loving memory of Henry Cross and Margaret Cross." Before their tablets he burned 3 items. The first was the corporate espionage branding iron that Victor Farnsworth had smashed onto his chest back then. He heated it until it was glowing red-hot, then dropped it into a basin of cold water. With a sharp hiss it cracked cleanly in half. The second was the patent certificate that Samuel Sterling had plagiarized. Flames leaped a meter high. The paper ash drifted upward and settled onto his hair. And the third was the forged death certificate that Lucius Cross had fabricated. He folded that yellowed sheet of paper 4 times and placed it into the deepest part of the brazier, watching as the flame swallowed it bite by bite. Olivia stood waiting for him outside the memorial hall. Sunlight streamed through the carved wooden windows, painting grids of light onto the flagstone floor. In her hand she held a new document. The cover was stamped with the Great Seal of the Department of Commerce. Department of Commerce Authorization. Abyss Technologies is approved to lead the establishment of the National Semiconductor Technology Center. The initial phase budget is $20 billion. She handed the document to him, pausing briefly. You are appointed as the center's director. Ethan took the document and opened to the first page, looking at the line of embossed gold lettering upon it. The afternoon sunlight fell onto his face, deepening the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. The corner of his mouth moved. It looked like a smile, and also like a slow breath of relief being released. This money, he closed the document, will be spent on the cutting edge. Never again will we let anyone choke us by the throat. 1 year later in the summer, Abyss Technologies' 5-nanometer chip entered mass production. The yield was 95%. Power consumption was 30% lower than comparable overseas products. Performance was 25% higher. The price was only 60%. Domestic phone manufacturers, one after another, announced they would adopt Abyss chips. Flagship models from Apple, Google, and Samsung's domestic lines completed full-scale transitions. The average price of phones dropped by 30%. Sales volume, instead of falling, surged by 40%. Consumers voted with their wallets, pushing Abyss's chip shipments all the way into the global top 3. Ethan established the Abyss Semiconductor Talent Fund, with an annual commitment of $1 billion to sponsor young domestic engineers to study in top-tier laboratories, while simultaneously inviting international experts to come for domestic exchanges. He also partnered with the National Science Foundation to set up dedicated semiconductor tracks at 30 universities, beginning targeted training for chip design, manufacturing, and packaging talent starting from freshman year. The textbooks were written by him and his team over half a year. They were open-sourced, free, usable by anyone. 2 more years passed. The Global Semiconductor Alliance awarded its highest annual honor, the Robert N. Noyce Award, to Ethan Kross. This was the first time in the award's 40-year history that it had been presented to someone who had rebuilt their company from a salvage yard. The awards ceremony was in San Francisco. Ethan walked onto the stage wearing a simple dark suit, with a small Abyss Technologies pin pinned to his lapel, made from a scrapped wafer polished smooth. He said, "Semiconductors are not anyone's private property. The reason I was struck down back then was because someone wanted to turn technology into a monopoly tool, to use it to choke others by the throat, to use it to extract super profits. Standing here today, I want to say only one thing. The purpose of technology's existence is to make this world a better place. I hope that one day, whether you are in New York or in Nairobi, in Tokyo or in some small town whose name I have never even heard, you will be able to use affordable, capable chips." He paused for a moment. The room beneath the stage was very quiet. Hundreds of pairs of eyes watched him. That day will not be too far away. Klaus Heidelberg was the first to stand up and applaud. Then came the senior executives in the second row, then the Samsung representatives in the third row, and then the entire venue. The applause surged up from the back rows, like ocean tide crashing against a reef. The camera flashes went insane. The sound of shutters merged into a single continuous roar. Ethan stood perfectly straight in the middle of that sea of light. Olivia and Ethan's wedding was held at the Old Cross family estate. No media. No pomp. 6 round tables were set up in the courtyard. The guests were all people they had known for 20 years, Old Mac, Raven, Grant, Olivia's parents, the handful of old employees who had never left during Abyss's earliest startup days. Sunlight leaked through the gaps between the leaves of the loquat trees, dappling the flagstone floor in spots of light and shadow. The wedding ring that Ethan slipped onto Olivia's finger was something he had made himself. It was polished from an edge-cut scrap piece of that original 3-nanometer wafer from back then. On the inner band of the ring, he had used a focused ion beam to etch a circuit trace pattern less than 1 micron wide, something visible only under a microscope. The design of the pattern was something he drew himself. The pattern was not a circuit diagram. It was a string of Morse code. Translated, it read, June 17, 3 years ago. Outside the acid washroom door. You handed me a bottle of water. That was the day Olivia had gone undercover for the very first time at the fab. At that time, she was still just an ordinary industrial security investigator, posing as an EPA inspector to infiltrate the cleanroom floor. In the hallway, she had come across Ethan, whose entire body was covered in injuries, his lips cracked and dry. She had pulled a bottle of mineral water from her bag and pressed it into his hand. She had not known who he was. He had not known who she was. 2 people in that hallway had held each other's gaze for 3 seconds, and then each had turned and walked away. You still remember that? Olivia looked at that nearly invisible etching on the inside of the ring, the rims of her eyes turning red. I remember everything. Ethan slid the ring onto her ring finger. This ring is worth more than a diamond. A diamond is just a piece of carbon. This represents the road we walked. Their married days were as calm and even as a glass of warm water. Every morning, Ethan would still go for a walk around that e-waste salvage yard in Fremont, wiping down that old probe station. Carved into the cast iron tabletop of the probe station was the single name Cross, which he had scratched into it long ago with a worn-out file. The strokes were crooked and uneven, like the handwriting of an elementary school student. Sometimes he would just sit there for a while, doing nothing, merely listening to the clamor of voices from the electronics market across the street, smelling the acidic scent of solder and flux mixed together. Olivia would go to her office at the Department of Commerce every day. When she came home from work, she would spend some time with Ethan in the lab. She didn't understand the deep technical details of semiconductors very well, but she understood industrial policy. She understood international power plays. She understood when to be tough and when to maneuver. Sometimes Ethan would call her at 3 in the morning, saying he had finally figured out some difficult technical problem. His voice would carry a sense of excitement, like a child who had just discovered a new toy. Olivia would listen in a drowsy haze, mumbling hum in acknowledgement, and wake up the next morning to find her phone still resting next to her ear. There was one time when they stayed in the laboratory for 3 straight days and nights without leaving, working to crack the quantum tunneling suppression scheme for the 2-nanometer architecture. At 4 in the morning, Ethan fell asleep leaning back in his chair, a marker still clutched in his hand. Olivia draped a jacket over him and stood at his side watching him for a while. In his sleep, his brow was still faintly furrowed, as if he were still solving some equation in his dreams. She reached out and gently smoothed the crease between his brows with her fingers, her heart turning completely soft. Every month they would go back to that old Oakland neighborhood. The rented tenement from back then had already been converted into a 6-story semiconductor startup incubator. The white outer wall was painted with the large blue letters, Abyss Incubation Center. Inside it was full of young people wearing cleanroom anti-static suits running wafer test experiments in the cleanrooms, debating the advantages and disadvantages of FinFET versus GAA, arguing until they were red in the face over material choices for 1-nanometer nodes. Every time Ethan went, he would speak with them for a while. He wouldn't lecture with any grand principles. He would simply tell them about how he had pried apart motherboards in a salvage yard back then, how he had recovered deleted experimental data from dead hard drives, how he had used a second-hand lithography machine to produce that 3-nanometer prototype. He would say, "The conditions you have now are 10,000 times better than what I had back then. You have EDA. You have lithography machines. You have funding. You have a supply chain. The one thing you don't have is an excuse." There was a young man who raised his hand and asked him, "Mr. Cross, when you were being framed back then, did you ever think about giving up?" Ethan thought for a moment and then said, "I did. More than once. But every time I thought about giving up, I would go and take apart a motherboard. I would remove the capacitors and resistors one by one, sort them into different categories, and then solder them back on one by one. By the time I finished taking it apart and soldering it back together, the sky would already be bright." The young man nodded, seeming to understand but not entirely. Later, he became one of the first batch of entrepreneurs to graduate from the Abyss Incubation Center. He built a project around advanced packaging, secured series of funding, and his company's valuation passed the $1 billion mark. During an interview he said, "Mr. Cross taught me one thing. In the darkest hour, do the most concrete thing." 10 years later, Ethan and Olivia's son was born. They gave him the name Lucas Cross. Lucas carried the meaning of light and illumination. On the day of Lucas's 1-month celebration, Ethan placed that bloodstained jade pendant into his swaddling cloth and said to Olivia, "I hope that in the future he will never have to go through the things I went through. Never be framed. Never be plagiarized. Never be pinned down beside an acid bath and have words branded onto his chest." Olivia held the child, swaying gently. The baby slept very soundly, his tiny fist tightly clenched around the faded red cord of the jade pendant. She said, "He won't. You've already paved the road. The road ahead will only get wider and wider." By the time Lucas Cross was 5 years old, he could already tell the difference between a field effect transistor and a bipolar junction transistor. At 7, he helped Ethan solder a simple driver board. The solder joints were round and full, cleaner than those of many trade school graduates. When Lucas grew to 15, he could already read and understand Ethan's academic papers. At 18, he entered MIT's Department of Electrical Engineering. At 20, he published his first paper in Nature Electronics on quantum effect suppression in 2-dimensional materials for sub-1 nanometer nodes. The reviewers called it opening a new window for the post-Moore era. Another 10 years passed. Lucas became the leading figure of a new generation in the semiconductor field. He led the development of a 1-nanometer architecture, using molybdenum disulfide as the channel material. It boosted chip performance tenfold and pressed power consumption down to 1/5 of the original, completely pulling Moore's Law back out of its coffin. Abyss Technologies built the world's very first 1-nanometer mass production line. Products were in such high demand that supply could not keep up, with orders backlogged 3 years into the future. Foreign companies lined up in droves to buy American chips. The Department of Commerce's export control list had become a piece of worthless paper, because the things they wanted to ban, the United States no longer needed to buy from anyone else. Ethan retired. Every day, he tended flowers in the old estate's courtyard. Roses and hydrangeas bloomed in huge clusters. He also planted 2 loquat trees. Every May, they bore a whole tree full of golden orange fruit, so sweet it was almost cloying. He sat in his rocking chair watching his grandson run across the lawn. That was Lucas's son, 5 years old this year. He already knew how to use a soldering iron to weld simple circuits. The last time, he had even taken apart his own toy car and installed a remote control module he had soldered himself. It could drift around the courtyard. Olivia sat beside him, her rocking chair swaying slowly. She held a copy of Nature Electronics in her hand. The cover was a photograph of Lucas with the headline, "The Architect of the 1-nanometer Era." The sunlight fell on her head full of white hair, warm and gentle. On the cover, Lucas's smile looked very much like a young Ethan, white teeth, eyes clean and pure. Ethan lifted his head to look at the clouds in the sky. The sky was very blue. The clouds were very white. The wind blew through the gaps between the loquat leaves, carrying the clean fragrance of grass and trees. From the semiconductor industrial park in the distance came the faint hum of machinery, the sound of a new generation continuing to walk forward. He recalled that day over 20 years ago, when he was pinned beside the acid bath. The screaming of cicadas, the branding iron, the stench of scorched flesh, Lily's turned-away face. Those images had been worn fuzzy by the years, like scratches on old film reels, no longer quite so clear. He reached his hand over and grasped Olivia's hand. The back of her hand bore age spots now, her skin as thin as paper, but her palm was warm. "It was worth it," he said. Olivia did not speak. She simply interlaced her fingers through his and squeezed tightly once. The sunlight settled onto their clasped hands. On her ring finger, the wafer wedding band glowed a faint, pale blue shimmer, like a tiny patch of starlight that would never fade.